At 7:15 p.m. on the 3rd of April 1860, a small crowd gathered outside the Pikes Peak stables in St. Joseph, Missouri. A brass band was playing. Cannons were fired in salute. The mood across the frontier town was electric because this was the night the mail was supposed to leave. A special pouch had arrived by train from Hannibal, Missouri, containing a handful of letters and newspapers from the East Coast, bound for California. At the center of the commotion was a wiry young rider, Johnny Fry, astride a bay mare named Sylph. He wore a red flannel shirt and blue trousers tucked into high boots. A leather mochila, a specially designed saddle cover with 4 locked mail pockets, was thrown across the horse's back. At the stroke of 7:15, the mochila was sealed, the rider mounted, and the animal surged down the muddy Main Street toward the Missouri River. A ferry carried them across to the Kansas side, and then Fry vanished into the dark prairie, riding hard into a legend. Behind him, the town cheered. Ahead lay the vast, sparsely settled interior of the continent. Fry was the first link in a human chain that would stretch from the Missouri River to Sacramento, California, a distance of nearly 2,000 miles. The plan required about 180 riders, 400 horses, and a network of relay stations placed every 10 to 15 miles. Each rider would ride at maximum speed, changing to a fresh horse at every station, covering around 75 to 100 miles before handing the mochila to the next man. The goal was to deliver mail between St. Joseph and Sacramento in 10 days, slashing weeks off the existing routes. No one was entirely sure it could be done. Fry covered the first leg from St. Joseph to Seneca, Kansas, about 80 miles, in less than 5 hours, an average speed of nearly 15 miles per hour. He changed horses at several relay stations, each time throwing the mochila across a fresh saddle in less than 2 minutes. In the early morning hours of April 4th, a second rider, William Richardson, took the pouch and pressed deeper into Kansas territory. The chain held. Across the Great Plains, over the Rocky Mountains, through the deserts of the Great Basin, and over the Sierra Nevada, rider after rider pushed the mail forward. On the evening of April 13th, 10 days out of St. Joseph, a rider named Sam Hamilton galloped into Sacramento, where another brass band was waiting. The first westbound Pony Express had succeeded. At the same time, an eastbound pouch had left Sacramento on April 3rd, carried by a rider named Billy Cody, who would later become Buffalo Bill. He rode through heavy snow in the Sierra Nevada, covering 120 miles before handing over to the next man. That pouch reached St. Joseph in 11.5 days. The two-way service was now a reality. Newspapers in San Francisco, New York, and London reported the achievement with astonishment. The Pony Express had compressed the continent. What happened next is a story of speed, collapse, and unexpected immortality. To understand why the Pony Express existed at all, you have to look at the map of the United States in early 1860. The nation was 33 states, with California on the far western edge, separated from the rest by 1,000 miles of territory not yet organized into states. The Transcontinental Railroad was talked about but years from completion. The telegraph had crossed the Mississippi and crept into the edge of the Great Plains, but it ended at St. Joseph. From there, any message bound for California had to travel by stagecoach or ship. The Overland Mail Company ran stagecoaches along a southern route through Texas and New Mexico to Los Angeles, and then north to San Francisco, a journey that took 22 to 25 days under good conditions. The ocean route went from New York to Panama, across the isthmus by rail, and then up the Pacific coast by another steamer, taking 3 to 4 weeks. For a nation on the brink of civil war, with political tensions pulling at its seams, the need to bind California to the Union with faster communication was urgent. California had become a state in 1850 after the gold rush. Its population had exploded, its gold and silver shipments were critical to the national economy, and its loyalty was far from certain. Southern states were already discussing secession. If war came, The federal government needed to secure the West. Business leaders and newspaper editors in California complained endlessly about the slow, unreliable mail that left them isolated from decisions made in Washington. They demanded a faster link. That demand was heard by a freight company called Russell, Majors and Waddell. The firm had built a vast freighting empire hauling supplies to army posts and settlements across the plains. William H. Russell was the restless visionary, John Jones the financial architect, Alexander Majors the strict and religious operations man, and William B. Waddell the quiet partner. They knew the terrain, owned thousands of wagons and oxen, and had contracts with the government. By early 1860, they were in a precarious financial position. Freight contracts were shrinking, the southern stagecoach route was threatened by the coming conflict, and the company needed a dramatic new business to survive. Russell convinced his partners that a fast pony relay across the central route would capture a government mail contract and prove the viability of the central route for the eventual railroad. The gamble was enormous. The central route ran through territory controlled by the Plains tribes, across deserts with almost no water, over mountains that were snowed in for half the year. Building the infrastructure for a 10-day mail service would require staggering speed. Russell, Majors, and Waddell gave themselves 2 months. The company moved with military efficiency. In February 1860, they ordered the construction of nearly 200 relay stations from St. Joseph to Sacramento. Some would be built new, others would take over existing stagecoach stops or trading posts. Station keepers were hired, often men willing to live in extreme isolation for $40 to $60 a month. Hundreds of horses were purchased, the best stock available in the territories, strong, lean animals capable of surging over hard ground at speed. The riders were recruited from a pool of young men who had grown up on the frontier, ranch hands, former soldiers, and out-of-work freight drivers. They had to be light, no more than 125 pounds and preferably not yet 20 years old. The work was dangerous. The job notice that supposedly ran in a California newspaper distilled the requirements. Wanted, young, skinny, wiry fellows, not over 1/8, must be expert riders, willing to risk death daily, orphans preferred. Whether that exact advertisement ever appeared is debated by historians, but it captured the essence. Riders would be alone on the trail, exposed to weather, wild animals, hostile raiding parties, and the sheer exhaustion of the ride. Pay was $25 a week, a substantial sum. By April 1st, the skeleton of the line was in place. Stations were spaced roughly 10 to 12 miles apart, with larger home stations every 75 to 100 miles where riders would sleep and recover. The first eastbound and westbound pouches were scheduled to depart simultaneously on April 3rd. The volume of mail carried was tiny, never more than 20 pounds on any run, but the symbolic weight was immense. The technical heart of the system was the mochila. It was a rectangle of leather that draped over the saddle, with 4 locked pockets called cantinas sewn into the corners. 2 pockets were accessible when the mochila was thrown over in one direction, 2 more when reversed. This allowed a rider to leap off a blown horse, yank the mochila free, and slap it onto the waiting fresh horse in a matter of seconds. The design was ingenious because it never interfered with the saddle itself. Station keepers could have the saddled horse standing ready, and the transfer took no more than 2 minutes from arrival to departure. Often it was less than 90 seconds. The mochila was never supposed to leave the rider's sight, and the mail locked inside traveled with a chain of custody more reliable than many modern deliveries. With the system launched, the Pony Express ran on a schedule that ignored weather, nightfall, or danger. Its first weeks were a triumph of frontier logistics. The newspaper headlines on both coasts proclaimed the 10-day miracle, but the schedule was a brutal human reality. Riders rode through Arctic blizzards on the Rockies, across sun-scorched alkali flats in the Utah Territory, through rivers swollen with spring melt, and past the smoldering camps of warriors watching from the bluffs. The route itself followed a jagged path. From St. Joseph, the line went west across northeastern Kansas, crossing the Little Blue and Platte Rivers into present-day Nebraska. It followed the Platte River Road, the same path used by the Oregon and Mormon trails, past Fort Kearny and Julesburg, then into the high plains of Colorado near present-day Julesburg. Then it struck northwest through Wyoming and Nebraska, following the Sweetwater River up to South Pass, the same gentle passage through the Continental Divide that the immigrant wagons had used. From there, the line dropped into the Great Basin of Utah to Salt Lake City, then south and west across the Salt Desert and the Alkali Flats toward the Nevada border. Riders pushed across what is now Nevada, an endless sequence of mountain ranges separated by dry basins, with names like Ruby Mountains, Shell Creek Range, Deep Creek, and the 40-mile desert. The final barrier was the Sierra Nevada, where snow depths could exceed 15 feet and temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. After cresting the pass near Lake Tahoe, the rider dropped into the foothills and into Sacramento. Each leg had its own name on the schedule, its own rhythm, its own particular ways of killing a man. The first spring was kind. Riders made the crossing in record times. The company boasted of beats of 12 and even 9 days. The mail was delivered, the investors' confidence grew, and a version of the service expanded to connect with telegraph wires advancing from the east. But the spring also revealed cracks. The Pony Express was hemorrhaging money. The cost of maintaining 200 stations, feeding hundreds of men and horses, and replacing mounts broken by the pace was staggering. The company had expected a federal subsidy, a mail contract worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, but the government contract never came. The Overland Mail Company's southern route still had political backing. Russell, Majors, and Waddell had built the Pony Express mostly with their own capital, bank loans, and a growing mountain of debt. Every rider who charged across the prairie was costing the firm $5 per half ounce of mail carried, while the postage rate was only $5 per ounce. The arithmetic simply did not work. Beyond the financials, the operational challenges were profound. The central route passed directly through the hunting grounds of the Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Shoshone people. The Pony Express stations were strung like beads across land that had been promised or recognized, but was now overrun by wagon trains, railroads, and military forts. Tensions were already high before the first rider left St. Joseph. A series of broken treaties, the discovery of gold in Colorado spurring a new wave of settlement, and the increasing presence of the United States Army had set the stage for conflict. In May 1860, just a month into operations, a group of Paiute warriors in present-day Nevada began attacking stations and supply trains in retaliation for encroachment and abuse. The violence was not random. It was targeted at the infrastructure of the white intrusion, the stations that linked the coasts. This was the Pyramid Lake War. The outbreak caught the Pony Express in a terrible position. The Trans-Sierra stations were isolated and vulnerable. Williams Station, a small Pony Express stop near the Carson River, was attacked and burned. Several white settlers were killed. Mounted Paiute parties moved along the line, destroying more stations, stealing or scattering horses, and killing station keepers. The mail stopped. The relay between the Great Basin and California was severed for weeks. Riders who attempted to cross were turned back by armed men or simply disappeared. The company had to resort to armed escorts and put pressure on the military for protection. The United States Army dispatched a force from California, and after a series of skirmishes and pitched battles, the station line was gradually reestablished. But the cost in horses, equipment, and human life was another financial blow. The riders who continued to ride through the contested region did so knowing they were targets. The winter of 1860 to 1861 was one of the worst in living memory. Snows came early to the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada. The passes became icy hells. The Pony Express had no choice but to keep the schedules, even when the regular stagecoaches shut down for weeks. Riders were sometimes reduced to pushing the mail on snowshoes, carrying the mail pouch on their backs, struggling through drifts that buried horses up to their necks. At one point, the company equipped a few men with skis, something almost unheard of in North America at the time, to get the mail through the Sierra. The stories that came out of that winter fed the legend. Riders like Bob Haslam, known as Pony Bob, made rides of extraordinary length, staying in the saddle for nearly 200 miles because no relief rider could reach him. In May 1861, Pony Bob rode 120 miles through the Nevada desert to deliver news of Lincoln's inauguration, and then turned around and rode back the same route after a short rest, covering 380 miles in a single assignment. Another rider, William Campbell, was said to have traversed drifted passes by tying the mail pouch to his chest, shedding his horse, and crawling over snow bridges that could collapse at any moment. The myth was being written in real time. But the myth could not pay the bills. By early 1861, Russell, Majors, and Waddell were in serious legal trouble. The company had used questionable financial instruments to keep the Pony Express afloat. The government investigated them for misusing funds from a trust contract. Accusations of fraud, bad checks, and defaulting creditors swirled. The outbreak of the Civil War in April 1861 further disrupted the nation's financial system. For the Pony Express, the war initially seemed to confirm the need for its services. Carrying news from the East to California in 10 days became even more critical as the secession crisis unfolded. Extras and dispatches raced across the line, bringing California's citizens the details of Fort Sumter, the first battles, and the political earthquake. The Pony Express achieved some of its greatest fame during these months, delivering news that kept California resolutely in the Union. But the fame did not translate into solvency. Meanwhile, the transcontinental telegraph that the Pony Express was supposed to precede was now racing toward completion. The telegraph was the real threat. The Pacific Telegraph Act was passed in 1860, authorizing the construction of a line from the existing telegraph network at the Missouri River to the Pacific coast. The work began in earnest in the summer of 1860. Crews worked from both ends, stringing wire across the prairie, through the mountains, and into the Great Basin. The Pony Express riders sometimes carried dispatches about the telegraph's progress. In a bitter irony, the very service that was proving the central route could be traversed quickly was about to be made obsolete by a technology that could transmit messages in seconds rather than days. On October 24, 1861, the transcontinental telegraph was completed at Salt Lake City. The wires were joined. The first message was sent from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. in a matter of minutes. 2 days later, the Pony Express officially ceased operations. The last pouch of mail was delivered, the riders paid off, the stations abandoned. The entire lifespan of the service had been just over 18 months. In that brief window, the Pony Express had captured the public imagination and lost its investors everything. Exact figures are hard to pin down, but estimates put the total losses at around $200,000, an enormous sum in the 1860s equivalent to many millions today. William Russell ended up in financial ruin and was eventually arrested. Alexander Majors would spend years trying to repay debts and writing memoirs that shaped the legend. The riders and station keepers scattered into the history of the West, some riding for the Army, some becoming scouts, others drifting into obscurity. What happened to all those stations and horses? The infrastructure quickly fell into disrepair. Wooden buildings were stripped by passing travelers or burned in subsequent conflicts. The trails were overtaken by the railroad that finally drove the Golden Spike in 1869. The mochillas and uniforms, never standardized, became relics. Yet the story of the Pony Express refused to die. Within a few years of its demise, dime novels and newspaper retrospectives began to celebrate the riders as embodiments of American grit. Buffalo Bill Cody folded the Pony Express into his Wild West show, dramatically reenacting the rides for audiences in the United States and Europe. With every performance, the factual edges blurred. The advertisement about orphans preferred became a catchphrase. The real dangers, the bankruptcies, the political context, all flattened into a simple myth of lone riders galloping against the clock. The myth obscures the operational and human details that make the Pony Express so remarkable as a feat of systems engineering. The relay system required precise coordination across 2,000 miles long before radio or modern dispatch. Station keepers had to keep accurate logs of arrivals and departures, coordinate food for the riders and feed for the horses, and maintain readiness at all hours. Because riders had to be prepared to leave the moment a mochila arrived, they slept in their clothes with their gear nearby. The rhythm of a station was that of a military outpost, with the added tension depending on the threat environment. In some quiet stretches, riders and station keepers might go days without seeing anyone hostile. In other sectors, the threat was constant. In present-day Nevada, William Campbell later described riding past the smoking ruins of a station he had expected to change at, the station keeper's body still inside. He pushed on, taking the mail another 40 miles to the next stop. The riders were not just athletes, they were couriers in a war zone, with no weapons except a revolver and no hope of backup. The mail itself was a kind of historical time capsule. The Pony Express carried mostly business correspondence, government dispatches, and newspaper reports. $5 per half ounce was a staggering sum, so telegrams and abbreviated notes were the norm. Some letters survive today in museum collections, paper thin and tightly creased, with the distinctive Pony Express stamp showing a rider in full gallop. The service delivered only about 35,000 pieces of mail in its entire history. That is a tiny fraction of modern postal volumes, yet each letter represented a crisis of urgency. The letters reveal the concerns of a nation in the midst of disruption. Businessmen were trying to secure gold shipments before prices collapsed. Families were trying to reach relatives before the telegraph made physical distance less acute. Newspapers competed fiercely to publish the latest war news via the Pony Express Extras, which would be set in type the moment the rider staggered into the office. The deep irony of the Pony Express is that it was a technological dead end. It was the fastest horse-based communication system ever devised, perfected right at the moment when the horse was being replaced by the wire. The riders achieved speeds that are still impressive for a human and an animal on open terrain, but the telegraph could do better than time itself, making distance meaningless. The Pony Express was a last gasp, but it was a gasp that left a permanent mark on the American psyche. It was a demonstration that the central route could be crossed in all seasons, that the interior was not an impassable barrier, and that the dream of a connected continent was possible with enough daring. The railroad that followed used the knowledge gained from those relay stations, the precise maps, and the seasonal weather patterns observed by the riders. The financial failure also holds lessons. The Pony Express was built by private enterprise in anticipation of a government contract that never materialized. The company gambled that Congress would see the value of a central route for mail and subsidize it as it subsidized the Southern Overland Mail. But the politics of the impending Civil War favored the Southern congressmen who protected the existing contracts, and the Republicans who supported the central route were not yet in a position to deliver funds before the telegraph made the argument moot. The service operated almost entirely on credit, a speculative bubble in mail delivery, and it burst with brutal impact. The principals of Russell, Majors, and Waddell were never able to recover their reputations or their fortunes fully. Why does the Pony Express still matter? It matters because of what the riders and station keepers endured, and because it reveals something about the American habit of risking everything on speed and spectacle. The service was born out of a time of existential crisis for the nation, when fast communication was not merely a business convenience but a strategic necessity. It was a human effort that succeeded on a physical level while failing economically. It transformed a handful of young men into folk heroes, and it compressed the continent in a way that seemed almost magical to people who had waited a month for news. When the telegraph finally clicked its connection, the magic transferred to the wire, but the image of the lone rider galloping through the night remained. The story of the Pony Express is not a simple story. It is layered with the violence of westward expansion, the displacement of native peoples, the speculative excesses of frontier capitalism, and the sheer physical pain of the work itself. The riders were not just archetypes of courage. They were young men paid modest wages for a job that could kill them in 100 ways. Some were indeed teenagers. Bronco Charlie Miller claimed he was only 11 when he rode, though records are murky. Jack Keatley rode for the Pony Express at age 18, and later wrote down his memories, describing how he nearly froze to death on a Nebraska plain, saved only when his horse stumbled into a gulch out of the wind. His account is matter of fact. I got off and walked him a while, but I was so stiff I could hardly stand. When I got to the station, I fell off my horse and they carried me into the house and worked over me for an hour before I could talk. This is not the stuff of glorious legend. It is the stuff of hypothermia and survival. The Pony Express also inadvertently created a cultural template for the American West that persists in film and literature. The lone rider against the landscape, the relay race against time, the stoic station keeper, all of these became Western archetypes. The short duration of the enterprise only added to its romantic appeal. It was the perfect story because it ended before it could become routine. It was a burst of pure velocity that burned through its own premise in 18 months and then stopped, leaving only memories, a few photographs, and the letters themselves. Looking at the geographical route on a map today, you can trace much of the Pony Express's path along highways and quiet county roads. The Pony Express National Historic Trail was designated by Congress in 1992, preserving some of the original station sites and ruts. At places like Hollenberg Station in Kansas or Fort Churchill in Nevada, you can stand in a reconstructed cabin and feel the isolation that defined the job. A Machilla reproduction sits in a museum case in St. Joseph, where Johnny Fry began his ride. In Sacramento, a statue of a rider commemorates the arrival of the first mail. These are physical anchors for a story that otherwise might float away entirely into myth. But the real texture of the 18 months is not in the statues. It is in the ledgers, the time cards, the casualty lists, and the extraordinarily compressed timeline. From conception to completion, the Pony Express was built in 60 days. It operated for 547 days. During that time, riders covered an estimated 650,000 miles cumulatively. They lost station keepers to ambush, horses to exhaustion, and the occasional mail pouch to flood or theft, but they lost only one mail pouch permanently. That is a record of reliability that modern courier services would envy. The service achieved what it set out to do technically, even as it failed commercially. This was the environment into which the first rider charged on that April night in 1860. At 7:15 p.m., the cannons fired, the band played, and Johnny Fry galloped into the dark. He did not know that the telegraph was coming, that the union was fracturing, that the company backing him was already insolvent. He knew only that he had a Machilla full of mail and a schedule to keep. That first ride set the pattern for what followed: staggering speed, improvised solutions, and the constant presence of risk. As the service matured over the summer of 1860, the rhythms became formalized. Riders would arrive at a relay station, call out their approach, and the station keeper would have the fresh horse ready, facing the direction of travel. Sometimes the station keeper was a teenager as well, alone for weeks at a time. The arriving rider would tear open the Machilla's cantinas, transfer the contents if necessary, reseal the locks, and be gone. The whole transaction was a few breaths. The station keeper would then take the blown horse, cool it down, feed it, and prepare it for the next run, often sending it back down the line so that horses shuttled back and forth like a piston. The logistics were simple but demanding. Each station required a supply of grain, hay, and water, which had to be hauled in by wagon along the same routes the riders traveled. In the desert stretches, water was a constant worry, and station keepers would sometimes have to ride out with canteens to meet a rider whose horse was collapsing from thirst. The riders learned to read the landscape intimately. They knew which creek beds were likely to be dry, which mountain passes were shortcuts in good weather but death traps in storms, which sections of the trail were vulnerable to ambush. They developed a sixth sense for the behavior of the tribes whose lands they crossed, distinguishing between groups that might be merely curious and those that had been pushed past tolerance. Some Pony Express stations employed interpreters and maintained an uneasy truce through gifts or payments. Others were simply attacked. In the summer of 1861, a concentrated series of raids by Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors in present-day Nebraska and Wyoming severed the line repeatedly. Horses were driven off, stations burned, station keepers killed. The company hired extra armed guards, and some riders began to carry rifles in addition to their revolvers, burdening the horses. The mail got through sporadically. At times, the eastern and western halves of the line operated independently, with huge gaps in the middle. Riders would travel in larger groups for mutual protection, then split off to cover their relay segments. The Pony Express became less a chain and more a gauntlet. Through it all, the figure of the rider became the public face of the service. Paintings and engravings in Harper's Weekly showed a glorified version, a gallant young man in buckskin, racing through a canyon while arrows flew past. The reality was more mundane and more brutal. Riders wore whatever they owned. The uniforms were never standardized. Most wore a red flannel shirt, but everything else varied. Some rode in Native American moccasins that gave better feel on the stirrup. Others wore heavy army boots. They were frequently cold, often hungry, and always sore. The saddle sores alone, from hours at a gallop on hard leather, were a kind of chronic injury. Men would sometimes tie themselves to the saddle to keep from falling off when exhausted. The Pony Express is often remembered as a mail service, but it was also a news service. The newspapers in San Francisco, Sacramento, and other western cities depended on the Pony Express to bring eastern papers and special dispatches. Editors would prepare a summary of important telegraphic news from the East, printed on lightweight paper, and send it via the Pony Express as a Pony Extra. These extras sold for a premium and were read aloud in saloons and public squares. The most famous of these dispatches was Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address in March 1860. The Pony Express delivered the text from the end of the telegraph at St. Joseph to Sacramento in 7 days, 17 hours, one of the fastest times ever recorded. The California press printed the speech, and for a moment, the far West felt linked to the national crisis in real time. News of the firing on Fort Sumter, the fall of Vicksburg, and the early campaigns of the Civil War all traveled by pony before the telegraph reached California. This news function amplified the political dimension of the Pony Express. It was not merely a private business. It was a tool of national unity. The riders were carrying the words that might determine whether California threw its resources to the Union or considered a course of neutrality or even secession. The state's gold and its position on the Pacific made it a strategic prize. The Pony Express, by keeping California informed about the unfolding conflict in real time, arguably helped cement its loyalty. The letters that riders carried also included communications between military commanders, federal officials, and territorial governors. In a very direct sense, the Pony Express was a wartime communications nerve before the war's main theater could install a more permanent alternative. And yet, even as the riders pushed through the snow and the raids, the telegraph poles were marching west. The Pony Express itself helped survey the route and carried supplies for the telegraph crews. The irony was not lost on the men. By September 1861, the telegraph line was within reach of Salt Lake City. Riders brought word that the wires were being spliced. The end was approaching. For the company's creditors, it could not come soon enough. In late October, the final connection was made. On November 20th, the last Pony Express sack of mail was delivered in St. Joseph and Sacramento. There was no ceremony. The riders simply stopped riding. The mochilas were put away. The Pony Express had lasted from April 3, 1860, to October 26, 1861. 18 months and 23 days. A little less than 19 months. Within that window, the riders who survived had ridden into a kind of immortality that they could not have understood at the time. They had been part of a system that was financially doomed from the start, brilliant in its execution, and hopelessly surpassed by a technology that could transmit the entire contents of their mochila in the time it took to saddle a horse. The story's power comes from that compression. It was a hinge moment, a brief, violent, glorious hinge between the world of muscle and the world of electricity. And the hinge held long enough to change how the country thought about its own geography. Now consider the afterlives of the riders. Some, like Buffalo Billy Cody, translated their riding into decades of fame. Others returned to ranching or army scouting. Many died young not from riding but from the ordinary hazards of the frontier, disease, accidents, violence. The station keepers, often older men, faded away without much record. A few wrote memoirs, their accounts contradictory and colored by time. The horses, the unsung heroes, were sold off or simply turned loose. The stations rotted or burned. By 1865, there was almost nothing left on the ground that a traveler would recognize as part of the Pony Express. The Transcontinental Railroad laid its tracks near the same corridor, and the prairie swallowed the ruts. What remains is the question: how could a service so brief and so unprofitable leave such a durable mark? Part of the answer is in the timing. The Pony Express came exactly when the nation needed a symbol of connection, of speed, of the ability to overcome vast distances. The Civil War gave it a narrative frame of national survival. The telegraph gave it a tragic ending, the replacement of horse by wire. The dime novels gave it a cast of larger-than-life characters. Hollywood would later pick up the thread, making movies that compressed the entire history into a single heroic ride. But beneath all that, the reality is compelling enough. Ordinary young men on good horses, pushing themselves to the limit to carry scraps of paper across a continent. The paper survived, and so did the story. At 7:15 p.m. on the 3rd of April 1860, that first rider had nothing in his pouch about the telegraph, about the debt, about the raids. He carried only the hope of a faster connection, and he rode toward the dark prairie with a few pounds of mail that might have included a business letter, a love note, or a government dispatch. Within a year and a half, everything would change. But in that moment, the hooves hit the mud, the river lay ahead, and the West unfolded mile by mile. But less than 2 months after that first ride, the Pony Express faced the deepest crisis of its brief existence. It was a moment that tested whether the entire system could survive, and it began not on horseback, but at a small trading post near the Carson River, on a spring morning in 1860. At first light on the 7th of May 1860, a Pony Express rider left the station at Dry Creek and pushed west toward the crossing known as Williams Station. The rider had been in the saddle for less than an hour when he saw smoke. Not the thin smoke of a campfire, but a thick, dark column rising from the direction of the station. He spurred his horse. As he came over the final rise, the scene below was unrecognizable. The station buildings were smoldering frames. The corral was empty. The bodies of 3 men lay in the dirt near the ruined cabin. The rider did not dismount. He turned his horse on the spot and galloped back the way he had come, retracing his route to raise the alarm. The mochila on his saddle carried mail bound for California, but he knew that the message he was carrying in his head was now far more urgent than anything stitched inside the leather pockets. The Pony Express line had been severed. By noon, word had reached the next stations. At 1 in the afternoon, a second rider pushed through to Virginia City, arriving with the news that Williams Station was destroyed and its keepers dead. By nightfall, the news had spread across the Carson Valley. The initial reports were confused and contradictory. Some said the attack was the work of Paiute warriors from the shores of Pyramid Lake. Others blamed white outlaws. What was clear was that a station had been wiped off the line, and that mail could no longer pass. The events that led to the burning of Williams Station had been assembling for months, hidden in plain sight. The Paiute bands of western Nevada, led by elders such as Numaga and Winnemucca, had watched the overland traffic increase year by year. Immigrant wagons, traders, and now the Pony Express poured through their hunting grounds, scaring off game, cutting timber, and grazing stock on meadows that the Paiute relied on for survival. The Paiutes had so far avoided open war. Numaga, a commanding figure known for his skill as a speaker, had argued for peace. He understood that the whites were too many to fight and that war would bring destruction upon his people. But understanding and forbearance have limits. In the early spring of 1860, a group of men operating a trading post at Williams Station crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They captured 2 young Paiute women and held them against their will. The Paiutes demanded their return. The traders refused. On the morning of May 6th, a party of Paiute warriors struck the station. They killed the 5 men inside, burned the buildings, and freed the captive women. The attack was not random. It was a targeted retaliation. But in the logic of the frontier, that distinction dissolved instantly. By the time the writer reached Virginia City, the only narrative that mattered was that the Paiutes had risen up and murdered whites. A call went out for volunteers to form a punitive force and to secure the Pony Express stations. At dawn on May 9th, a mounted company of about 105 men rode from Virginia City toward Pyramid Lake. They were miners, storekeepers, teamsters, and veterans of the California gold fields. Most had no formal military training. They elected a leader, Major William Ormsby, a veteran of the Mexican-American War who had fought in skirmishes in California. Ormsby had confidence, but confidence is not preparation. The company expected to scatter a few Paiute fighters, burn some villages, and be back in town within 3 days. They carried rifles, revolvers, and a sense of invincibility that came from never having faced a determined enemy on his own ground. The Paiutes, meanwhile, had prepared their own ground. Numaga had reluctantly accepted that war was now inevitable. He gathered his warriors and positioned them along the Truckee River, near a narrow canyon where the terrain would favor the defenders. He understood that the whites would come looking for a straight fight, and he intended to give them one on his terms. The warriors numbered between 500 and 700 men, though exact counts were never confirmed. They had firearms, some purchased from passing traders, others taken from earlier fights. They knew the ground, the crossings, and the rhythms of a cavalry advance. On the morning of May 12th, Ormsby's company rode north along the Truckee River. At approximately 10 a.m., they entered the canyon of the Truckee, a place where the river narrowed and the sagebrush gave way to rocky slopes on both sides. The riders were stretched out in a loose column, their visibility limited by the terrain. No scouts had been pushed far ahead. The column moved at a walk, unaware that they were walking straight into a trap. At 10:30, a small group of Paiute fighters appeared on the eastern bluffs, shouting and gesturing. A few shots rang out. The volunteer company quickened its pace, eager to close with what looked like a raiding party. The Paiutes retreated, drawing the whites deeper into the narrows. By 11 a.m., the trap was sprung. From the heights on both sides, volleys of arrows and rifle fire poured down. Ormsby's men took cover among the rocks, but they had no clear line of fire. Their horses panicked and broke away. The Paiutes, hidden in the rocks and sage, were nearly invisible. The volunteers fell, one after another. Ormsby tried to rally a retreat, but the retreat itself became a slaughter. Men dropped their weapons and ran toward the river, only to be cut down or drowned. The Paiutes pursued the survivors for miles across the open flats toward Pyramid Lake. The fighting lasted until late afternoon. By 5 o'clock, it was over. 76 white men were dead, including Major Ormsby. The Paiute dead are estimated at fewer than 10. The Battle of Pyramid Lake, also known as the Ormsby Massacre, was a complete and utter defeat. The news of the disaster reached Virginia City late that night. A rider who had escaped the ambush stumbled into town with a broken arm and a story that did not fit the earlier bravado. The mail route was not merely severed. It was now on the other side of a hostile force that had demonstrated its ability to destroy an armed company. Panic set in. Settlers in the Carson Valley abandoned their homes and crowded into hastily fortified camps. The Pony Express stations between the Sierra Nevada and present-day Central Nevada were abandoned or burned. The company lost more than half a dozen stations in the immediate aftermath, along with horses, equipment, and the lives of station keepers. The line fell silent. The mail stopped moving entirely between California and the East. This was not a temporary interruption. For weeks, there was no Pony Express service. The telegraph line to California did not yet exist, so the West Coast was cut off from the Union. San Francisco newspapers, which had been printing Eastern news delivered by the Pony Express, now had nothing but local speculation. Rumors of a general Indian uprising spread as far as Oregon. The California state government called out the militia. A second, better organized force of regular Army troops and California volunteers was sent east under Colonel John C. Hayes to subdue the Paiutes. That expedition fought a sharp engagement in early June, then entered into a tense but durable treaty. The line of stations was slowly rebuilt, this time with heavier fortifications and armed guards. By July, the mail began to move again, but the company had been shaken to its financial core. The cost of rebuilding, the loss of revenue during the shutdown, and the stampede of nervous investors all pushed the Russell, Majors, and Waddell firm closer to ruin. The Pony Express had proven it could deliver the mail fast, but it had also proven how easily that speed could be erased by a single morning's violence. Why did the system fail so catastrophically? The answer lies in the distance between the design of the Pony Express and the reality of the land it crossed. The route had been selected for its geographic efficiency, not for its political safety. The stations were spaced at intervals that a horse could cover at speed, not at intervals that a defending force could protect. The company assumed that the Native American tribes along the route would either be friendly or indifferent. That assumption collapsed because it never accounted for the deeper tensions that the Pony Express itself was worsening. Every station that was built, every herd of horses turned out to graze, every rider that thundered through a Paiute or Shoshone hunting ground was a provocation. The Pony Express was not just a mail service, it was a colonizing force. It marked a trail that would soon be widened into wagon roads, stagecoach routes, and eventually railroads. The Paiutes understood this. The company did not. The events of May 1860 also exposed the brittle nature of the entire transcontinental communications network. There was no redundancy. If a single station was destroyed, the riders could sometimes bypass it by riding a double stage, but if dozens of stations were wiped out over a 200-mile stretch, the chain was broken completely. The mochilas could not be picked up and carried by another means. There were no alternative routes south through Arizona without adding weeks, and no detour north through Oregon in a time of volcanic terrain and deep snow. The system was all or nothing, and in May it became nothing. From the perspective of the riders, the Pyramid Lake War was a terrifying interruption. Those who had ridden the western leg found themselves suddenly unemployed, and many volunteered for the militia that marched to the Truckee. A few riders who had been in the area during the attacks were killed. Their names are not all recorded. One rider, Robert Haslam, known as Pony Bob, would later find himself carrying a special dispatch through the very region where the stations had been burned, riding over 380 miles in a single extended run to get the mail through after the line was restored. That ride would become part of the legend, but the legend does not dwell on the burned timbers and shallow graves that Haslam passed along the way. The policy failures were multi-layered. The federal government had no effective military presence in the Nevada Territory in 1860. The nearest army posts were in California and Utah, each hundreds of miles away. The Pony Express had asked for cavalry escorts but was given only symbolic support. The cost of stationing troops along the line would have been prohibitive, and the United States Army was already stretched thin on the eve of civil war. The company was on its own, and it proved unable to defend its own assets. The station keepers were not soldiers. They were hired to swap horses, not fight battles, and yet they bore the brunt of the attacks. When the first shots rang out at Williams Station, there was no retreat plan, no fortified fallback, no alarm system beyond a lone rider fleeing with the news. The aftermath of the Pyramid Lake War lingered in the operation of the Pony Express until its final day. The company learned hard lessons. Stations were rebuilt with thick adobe or log walls. Armed guards were posted at many locations, and riders began carrying weapons as a matter of routine. The expense of these measures ate into margins that were already negative. The public image of the service changed as well. Where previously the riders had been celebrated as daring couriers, they now became symbols of a dangerous frontier, the messengers of a civilization at war with the very people whose land it crossed. The romance of the Pony Express always had a dark underside, and after May 1860, that darkness was impossible to ignore. Why does this specific event still matter, beyond the narrow history of a short-lived mail route? Because it illustrates the cost of infrastructure built on someone else's ground without consent or compensation. The Pony Express is often told as a story of triumph, of American ingenuity and grit. But the Pyramid Lake War reminds us that the same system that carried Lincoln's inaugural address also helped ignite a conflict that left dozens dead and displaced entire communities. The riders and station keepers who died were, in many cases, ordinary working men who had signed on for a job, not a war. The Paiute warriors who fought were defending their homes. The true failure was the absence of any framework for coexistence. The Pony Express, like so many projects of its era, operated on the assumption that the continent was empty. That space was just distance, and that speed was the only metric that mattered. It was not empty, and speed could not outrun history. The gap between the image of the Pony Express and its reality was never wider than in the weeks after the Pyramid Lake Massacre. Back in St. Joseph, the company's directors were trying to secure yet another loan to keep the service alive. They did not advertise the burned stations or the dead. Instead, they touted the delivery of important dispatches and promised a resumption of service. The press in the East, already preoccupied with the political crisis that would soon explode into civil war, gave the Indian War in Nevada only sporadic attention. The raids that followed in 1861 by Sioux and Cheyenne warriors have a larger place in the popular memory, partly because they were more widespread and partly because they were chronicled by newspapermen and illustrators. But the first rupture, the one that nearly killed the Pony Express in its infancy, happened in a canyon on the Truckee River, on a May morning when 100 horsemen rode into an ambush they never saw coming. There were survivors of that battle. Some escaped by hiding in the sagebrush until nightfall, then walking miles with arrows still embedded in their clothing. One man, a young rancher named John Freeman, crawled to the river and floated downstream, clinging to a log. He reached a friendly camp 2 days later, his body cut and feverish. His testimony, along with others, reached the California papers. But the full story of what happened at Pyramid Lake would not be assembled for decades, because no official investigation was ever conducted. The volunteers were not regular soldiers, and their deaths were not recorded in a central military archive. There was no cockpit voice recorder, no black box. The events were reconstructed from ragged memories, contradictory newspaper accounts, and oral histories from Paiute elders who passed down their own version of the fight. In that version, Numaga had wept before the battle, because he knew that even a victory would not stop the tide. The Paiute perspective is essential to understanding why the system failed. Numaga had spent the winter of 1859-1860 traveling among the bands, urging restraint. He argued that war would bring the army, and the army would bring cannons and cavalry, and the Paiute way of life would be destroyed. His words were prophetic. After the initial victory, the Paiute warriors withdrew to Pyramid Lake, and they did not press their advantage into the settlements. They had made their point, and they expected the whites to understand that a price must be paid for the crimes at Williams Station. Instead, the whites saw only a massacre that required vengeance. The second expedition, led by Colonel Hayes, was better armed and better led. It fought a skirmish at Pinnacle Mount on June 2, 1860, and the Paiutes were forced to abandon the position. A tenuous peace was then negotiated. Numaga survived the war and lived for many years, but his people's territory was incrementally carved away by new roads, new mines, and new settlers. The Pony Express resumed its runs, but the lesson had been taught. The line could be broken, and when it broke, people died. In the broader arc of the Pony Express story, the Pyramid Lake War is often glossed over because it complicates the heroism. The old dime novels did not dwell on the dead station keepers or the blunders of the volunteer army. The movies did not film the massacre. Yet the war reveals the Pony Express as more than a postal system. It was a geopolitical instrument that, for all its speed and glamour, operated on a knife edge of violence. The riders who later served as scouts for the army or fought in the Indian Wars of the 1860s and 1870s were in some cases the very same men who had carried mail through the same territory. The distinction between courier and combatant blurred, and the mochila on the saddle was as much a tool of empire as a postal bag. That uncomfortable truth sits alongside the bravery and the endurance, and a full accounting of the Pony Express must hold both. Now consider the morning of May 7th again, but from the rider's perspective. He was 18 or 19 years old, likely an orphan of the frontier, hired for his light weight and his nerve. He saw the smoke and the bodies. He did not waste time dismounting to check for survivors because his training told him that the mail must go through and that the alarm must be sounded. In the moment he wheeled his horse, he became the carrier of a message that would launch a war. He did not know that. He only knew that he had to ride, and he did. That ride, the ride away from the disaster, was as important as any of the celebrated express rides. It was the ride that told the world the system had failed, and that failure was written in ash and blood. The Pony Express would continue for another year and a half after the Pyramid Lake War, but it never fully recovered its sense of invulnerability. The winter of 1860 brought the heaviest snows in memory, and riders were again forced to use snowshoes and abandon horses altogether in the High Sierra. The eastern stations were harried by Sioux raids in the summer of 1861, as the earlier narrative has described. And always, the telegraph poles marched closer. The men who ran the stations and rode the relays during those final months were operating a system that was already obsolete, a system that had outlived its moment of necessity. They kept riding because it was a job, and because the company had not yet told them to stop. The last mochila arrived in St. Joseph on November 20th, 1861, but the last true test of the Pony Express had occurred 18 months earlier, when a young rider crested a hill and saw smoke. The system had been built for speed. It discovered, in that instant, that speed was not enough. The deeper meaning of the Pony Express is often found in its compression of risk. In the span of 18 months, a group of men and horses experienced a full cycle of innovation, crisis, adaptation, and obsolescence. The Pyramid Lake War was the crisis that proved the rule. It showed that connecting a continent required more than relays of fast horses. It required a political and military structure that simply did not exist in the West in 1860. The Union was coming apart over slavery, and the federal government could not spare troops to guard a mail route in Nevada. The stations burned because there was no state authority to protect them, and no tribal authority that had given permission for them to be there in the first place. The Pony Express was an attempt to impose order on a disordered land, but the disorder pushed back. That pushback echoes through later American infrastructure projects. The Transcontinental Railroad, built a few years later, would also be built through indigenous lands, and it would also face attacks and require massive military escorts. The telegraph lines that replaced the Pony Express were strung along the same route, and their crews were guarded by cavalry. The lesson of May 1860 was not lost on the planners of the railroad, but they too relied on a model of conquest rather than consent. The difference was that the railroad had the backing of the United States government and the Union Army, and the Pony Express did not. The Pony Express was a private gamble, and it lost the gamble when the Paiutes decided to fight. For the riders themselves, the memory of the war stayed with them. In later years, a few wrote letters or gave interviews. Pony Bob Haslam, who became famous for his enormous ride, never forgot the sight of the burned-out stations. He later served as a scout and interpreter, living a life that mirrored the violence of the frontier. William Cody turned his own experiences into a stage career, never mentioning the darker side of the story. Most writers simply vanished from the record. Their names did not appear in government reports. Their graves, if marked at all, were wooden crosses in high desert cemeteries that the wind eventually took. The horses fared no better. The horses of the Pony Express deserve a moment of recognition because the system was designed around their physical limits and their extraordinary endurance. The best stock was selected from California ranches, Kentucky bloodlines, and wild Mustang herds. They were trained to run at speed for 10 to 12 miles, sometimes more. In the ash of the Pyramid Lake War, dozens of these horses were killed or scattered. The loss was devastating to the company, not only because of the immediate cost, but because a horse that could sustain a Pony Express run was not easy to replace. The horses that survived the war often bore the scars of the journey: split hooves, girth galls, damaged tendons. They were unsung animals that carried a nation's words on their backs, and when the service ended, they were sold for whatever price they would fetch. What can be learned from the failure of the Pony Express in those violent weeks? The first lesson is that communication systems are not neutral. The act of sending a letter across another people's territory is an act of power. The speed of the Pony Express was not just a wonder, it was an intrusion. The second lesson is that speed creates vulnerability. The faster the system, the more it depends on perfect continuity, and the more disastrous a single break becomes. Third, and most sobering, is that the lives of the people who operate complex systems become expendable when the system is valued above its human components. The riders were celebrated in print, but the station keepers died without memorials. The Paiute dead are counted in the archives only as enemy casualties, bereft of individual names. The system absorbed these deaths and kept running, until it didn't. The Pyramid Lake War also forces a reconsideration of the Pony Express's most famous achievement: the delivery of Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address in March 1860. The speed of that delivery was made possible, in part, by the rebuilt line that had been strengthened after the war. The mochila that carried Lincoln's words rode through stations that had been burned and rebuilt, past graves that were not yet grown over. The speech itself, a careful argument for the preservation of the Union, was read in San Francisco by men who had no direct experience of the Eastern crisis. But they had learned in their own way that unity was fragile, and that the threads holding the country together could be cut by an arrow as easily as by a secession vote. The news that the Union was dissolving in the East landed on a West that already knew something about the cost of a divided land. And so the Pony Express remains a legend, but a legend with sharp edges. It is the story of a system that was too fast to last, too expensive to profit, and too proud to admit its own fragility. The 18 months of its operation contained enough drama to fill a century of memory. The riders, the horses, the stations, the snow, the desert, the raids, all of it compressed into a single continuous arc. The Pyramid Lake War is the point on that arc where the legend cracked open and the raw reality bled through. It is a reminder that behind every myth of the frontier, there is a morning with smoke on the horizon and a rider turning his horse for home, carrying nothing but fear and the weight of what he has just seen. The Pony Express ended not with a bang, but with the quiet splicing of a telegraph wire. The last rider delivered his mochila and rode away. The newspapers noted the event in a few lines, then turned their attention to the war that was consuming the nation. The telegraph chattered with battle reports, casualty lists, and the movement of armies. The country had found a new nervous system, and the old one was already forgotten. But the memory of those 18 months did not die. It grew, filtered through nostalgia and the need for a usable past. The Pyramid Lake War and the other raids that followed were smoothed out of the popular story, replaced by images of solitary horsemen against the sunset. The blood and the ash were too complicated for the dime novels. Yet the writers who survived never forgot the real color of that ash, the real sound of the bullets and the arrows. They carried it with them into old age, and a few wrote it down. Those writings, fragmentary and unpolished, are the closest thing we have to a cockpit voice recorder for the Pony Express. They tell us that the legend was always a simplification, and that the true story is darker and more human. The system that could deliver a letter in 10 days could also deliver death in 10 seconds. The same horse that raced across the plains was sometimes found wandering with an empty saddle and an arrow in its flank. The same mochila that held a love letter held, on another day, news of a massacre. The Pony Express was all of these things at once, and it matters because it refuses to be just one thing. The federal government never formally investigated the Pyramid Lake War in the way that a modern agency might investigate a transportation disaster. There was no National Transportation Safety Board to determine probable cause. But if we apply today's investigative lens to the events of May 1860, the contributing factors emerge clearly. Inadequate risk assessment, lack of security protocols, failure of intelligence about local conditions, and an organizational culture that prioritized schedule over safety. The company's decision to operate through contested territory without adequate protection was a root cause. The station keepers were not trained in diplomacy or self-defense. The riders were not briefed on the political situation. The route was chosen for speed, not stability. When the system failed, the fail-safe mechanism was a lone rider with a revolver, which proved tragically inadequate. The human factor cannot be discounted. The men at Williams Station who abducted the Paiute women set in motion a chain of events that would kill over 70 people. Their actions were criminal by any standard, but they were also a product of a frontier culture in which violence against Native Americans was rarely punished. The Pony Express, as an institution, bore indirect responsibility for the environment it encouraged. The stations were islands of white settlement in a sea of indigenous nations, and the islands were not governed by any law but their own. When the reckoning came, it came without warning and without mercy. In the immediate aftermath, the company did what corporations often do. It blamed external forces, sought new capital, and promised better security. It did not fundamentally re-examine its relationship with the tribes along the route. That failure of introspection would be repeated in the summer of 1861, when Sioux and Cheyenne raiders burned stations in Nebraska. The pattern was the same: a period of uneasy coexistence, a local incident that escalated, a military response, and a temporary restoration of service. By then, the Civil War was raging, and the Pony Express was already a ghost. The investors had lost their money, the founders had moved on to other schemes, and the riders were looking for new work. The system had burned itself out. Yet the legend of the Pony Express endures precisely because of that compression. 18 months is not a long time. It is less time than a modern teenager spends in high school, but within those 18 months, the Pony Express demonstrated something about the human capacity for speed, endurance, and connection. It showed that a handful of men and horses could stitch a continent together, however briefly. The Pyramid Lake War showed the cost of that stitching, the blood price of a nation's ambition. Both truths are necessary. The Pony Express is not a children's story. It is a chapter in the long, violent history of American communication, and it deserves to be remembered whole. The writers who survived the war went on to other lives. Some joined the Union Army. Some went back to mining. A few became stagecoach drivers on the new routes that followed the old Pony Express trail. They watched the telegraph wires go up and the railroad tracks go down, and they knew that their moment had passed. But they also knew that they had done something that no machine could replicate. They had ridden a horse at a dead run through a landscape that was trying to kill them, and they had delivered the mail anyway. That knowledge, quiet and unadorned, is the real foundation of the Pony Express legend. The rest is ornament. The Paiute warriors who fought at Pyramid Lake also had their lives changed, though their stories are less often told. Many of them would later fight in the Bannock War and other conflicts. Some became scouts for the army, using their knowledge of the land to survive in a new political order. Numaga lived until 1871, dying at the age of 57. He was buried near Pyramid Lake, not far from the canyon where his warriors had won a victory that turned out to be a prelude to defeat. The lake is still there, a deep blue body of water in the Nevada desert, and the Truckee River still flows from Lake Tahoe to the Sink. The land remembers. The Pony Express route itself is now a National Historic Trail. Markers line the paths where the station stood. In some places, the old adobe walls are still visible, melted back into the earth but recognizable. In others, there is nothing but a plaque and a view. Tourists drive the route in air-conditioned cars, stopping at interpretive centers to read about the brave riders. The brochures and signs tend not to mention the bodies. They mention the speed, the glory, the end of the frontier. But the frontier did not end. It was brought to an end by violence and by the crackle of telegraph electricity, by treaties and by railroads, by the slow erasure of one world and the rise of another. The Pony Express was a hinge between those worlds, and hinges bear weight. Imagine again the morning of May 7th, 1860. The air is cool and the sage is damp with dew. The rider approaches Williams Station, expecting a change of mount and a few minutes' rest. Instead, he sees the smoke. He reins in, his horse snorting at the smell of char. He looks at the bodies, then at the horizon, then back the way he came. He makes a decision. He turns the animal and gives it the spurs. The hooves thunder away, and the mail in his pouch is joined by a new message, one that will take days to reach its destination and will never be written down. That message is a simple one. The system is broken, but it will be fixed for a time because the men in charge cannot afford to let it stay broken. And so the rider rides and the system repairs itself, and the mail continues to flow until the day, not so long after, when the wires go live and the horses are no longer needed. That is the Pony Express. It was not a triumph of technology over nature. It was a fragile, costly, human arrangement that worked just long enough to become a legend. Its brief life was punctuated by this one sharp crisis, a crisis that could have ended it before it had truly begun. The fact that it did not end is a testament to a certain kind of stubbornness, the same stubbornness that drove boys to ride through blizzards and across rivers. The Pony Express is best understood not as a success story, but as a survival story. It survived the Pyramid Lake War, just as it survived the winter snows and the summer heat and the bankruptcy of its founders. It survived until it was no longer needed, and then it vanished, leaving behind the ghost of a trail and a few thousand words in the archives. That ghost still rides. You can see it in the faces of the cowboys in the old photographs, in the poetry of the West, in the countless movies and novels that compress all of American history into a single gallop. The real Pony Express was messier, bloodier, and more human than any of those depictions. It was a system of extraordinary speed and extraordinary violence, of high ideals and low finance, of boys who became men and men who became legends. And it all started with a horse, a mochila, and a man in a hurry, riding into the dark. At 7:15 p.m. on the 3rd of April 1860, the first rider had nothing in his pouch but hope and paper. By May of that year, he would have something else. The knowledge that the line he rode could betray him, that the land he crossed was alive with other stories, other claims. That knowledge would deepen with every mile, until the day the telegraph poles stood straight and silent, and the last rider turned in his saddle and looked back at the trail that had already begun to disappear. The Pony Express lasted 18 months. The legend has lasted more than 160 years. The difference between the two is everything. At 10:30 in the morning on the 24th of October 1861, a lineman for the Pacific Telegraph Company touched two bare copper wires together in the telegraph office at Salt Lake City, Utah Territory. The connection linked the eastern and western segments of the transcontinental line. A message traveled from San Francisco to New York in a flicker of electricity. Brigham Young, president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, sent the first official dispatch. It read in part, "Utah has not seceded, but is firm for the Constitution and the laws." The words were polite, political, and utterly unremarkable. Their real meaning was not in the text. It was in the speed. A message that had taken 10 days by Pony Express now took seconds. The age of the horse was over. The Pony Express had 48 hours to live. The news reached the eastern agents of the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company the same day. The company, which had operated the Pony Express under the larger umbrella of Russell, Majors, and Waddell, was already collapsing under debt and legal trouble. The officers saw the telegraph not as a rival but as a final blow. On the 26th of October, a Saturday, the order went out: suspend all service. Riders were told to finish their runs but not to take new mail. Stations would be abandoned. Horses would be sold. The mochillas, heavy with leather and polished brass, would be packed into crates and forgotten. The enterprise that had begun with cannon fire and champagne in April 1860 would end with a handful of telegrams and a ledger full of red ink. At 2:15 in the afternoon on the 26th, a rider named Henry Wallace saddled his horse at the Folsom Station, east of Sacramento. He was 20 years old, lean, with calloused hands and a quiet demeanor. He had ridden for the Express for 7 months. His mochila that day was light: a few letters, a newspaper, and a dispatch from the governor of California to the mayor of St. Joseph, Missouri. The dispatch would never reach its destination because the system would stop before it got halfway. Wallace did not know that. He took the mochila, swung it over the saddle, and mounted. The station keeper watched him go, then turned back to his logbook and wrote a single line: "Rider departed, weather clear, no incident." It was the last entry in the Folsom Station log. The book was thrown into a crate and eventually found its way to a basement in Sacramento, where it was eaten by silverfish and forgotten. Wallace rode east along the American River, the same route taken by the first westbound rider 18 months earlier. The trail was already changing. Telegraph poles stood beside it, the wire humming in the afternoon breeze. The new poles were rough-cut pine, not yet weathered, bleeding sap like wounds. Wallace had watched them go up section by section over the summer. He knew what they meant. The riders talked about it at the stations, over weak coffee and hard biscuits. They spoke of the telegraph with a mix of wonder and dread. Some said it was a miracle. Others said it was the end of something they could not name. Wallace prodded his horse to a canter and tried not to think about it. At 3:47 he reached the Placerville station, where a fresh mount waited. The station keeper handed him a canteen and said, "You're the last one, Harry. Word came through on the wire. After this run they're shutting us down." Wallace dismounted long enough to change horses. He did not reply. He tightened the cinch, checked the mochila, and rode on. The sun was lowering, casting long shadows across the pine forest. The air smelled of dust and resin. He had another 40 miles to ride before he could rest, and then nothing, no more runs, no more pay, just an empty trail and a horse that would be sold to a rancher. The Pony Express was ending, and he was the one carrying the final thread of it across the Sierra Nevada. At 6:20 in the evening, as Wallace climbed toward the summit, the telegraph operator in San Francisco clicked out a message to the East Coast. It was a business transaction, a shipment of wool from a warehouse on Market Street to a buyer in Boston. The message took 3 minutes to compose and a fraction of a second to transmit. The operator then leaned back in his chair and lit a cigar. He had no idea that somewhere in the mountains, a man on a horse was still carrying mail the old way, that the old way was being extinguished at that exact moment, that the continent was shifting from one kind of time to another. The operator's name was Charles Minot. He would later become a railroad executive, and he would never once think about the Pony Express riders. Wallace reached the Strawberry Station at 9:45 that night. The station was a small log building with a corral and a hay shed. The station keeper, a French-Canadian named Baptiste, had already received the shutdown order. He had packed his belongings into a carpetbag and was waiting for the last rider before locking the door. Wallace ate a bowl of beans, drank a tin cup of rye whiskey, and slept for 3 hours on a cot by the stove. At 1 in the morning he rose, changed horses, and continued east into the darkness. The stars were bright and cold. The horse snorted steam. The telegraph wires, invisible against the sky, hummed with messages that Wallace would never read. He rode on, and behind him the station went dark. What happened? The Pony Express ended not with a disaster but with a quiet administrative decision and a bank failure. The reasons were financial, not physical. The service had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The original investment of $175,000 by Russell, Majors, and Waddell had been swallowed by operating costs. Each horse, each rider, each station, each grain of oats, each leather saddle, each hammer, each nail, each cup of coffee, each blanket, each bullet, each life lost in the Pyramid Lake War, all of it cost money. The price to send a letter had been set at $5 for a half ounce. That was high, but the volume of mail was never enough. The government contracts, which had seemed like a guarantee, covered only a fraction of the expenses. The founders had hoped for a federal mail contract that would make the Express viable. That contract never came. Congress debated it, but the Civil War consumed the nation's attention and treasury. The Pony Express was left to starve. In the spring of 1861, the company was already in crisis. William Russell, the flamboyant promoter, had been arrested for fraud. He had accepted bonds from the Department of the Interior in trust for Indian tribes, then used them as collateral for personal loans. The scandal broke in March. Russell was ruined. Alexander Majors and William Waddell, the other partners, tried to distance themselves, but the damage was done. The firm of Russell, Majors, and Waddell, once the largest freight concern in the West, collapsed under a mountain of debt. The Pony Express, as one of its subsidiaries, was dragged down with it. The service continued to operate under the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company, which was essentially a reorganized shell. But the shell was hollow. The money was gone. The investors had lost faith. The telegraph was coming. The Pacific Telegraph Act of 1860 had authorized the construction of a line from the Missouri River to San Francisco. The project was rushed forward by Hiram Sibley, president of the Western Union Telegraph Company, who saw a chance to connect the continent before the railroad could. Construction began in July 1860. Crews worked from both ends, east and west, stringing wire across the plains, through the mountains, and over the desert. The Pony Express riders passed them every day, carrying the very messages that the wires would soon make obsolete. It was a strange, liminal period. The riders and the linemen shared the same trail, the same stations, sometimes the same meals. They were two competing technologies staring at each other across the divide of a single generation. The riders understood that they were being replaced. The linemen understood that they were the replacement. Neither spoke of it directly. On October 24th, the line was completed at Salt Lake City. The first message, from Brigham Young to J. H. Wade, president of the Pacific Telegraph Company, was a formal announcement. The second message was from the governor of California to the president of the United States. The third was from a merchant in Virginia City, Nevada, to his brother in Pennsylvania, and it said simply, "Arrived safe. The mines are good, send money." The age of instant communication had begun, and the Pony Express, which had seemed so impossibly fast only a year before, was suddenly as antiquated as a stone axe. The company did not fight the decision to shut down. There was no fight left. The officers sent a circular to all station keepers announcing the suspension. Some stations received the news by telegraph. Others received it by the last Pony Express rider who carried the order in his mochila, a message that announced its own obsolescence. The riders and keepers were told to abandon their posts, sell what they could, and find their own way home. Many were owed back wages they would never collect. Some took the horses as payment, riding them to the nearest town and selling them for a fraction of their worth. Others simply walked away, disappearing into the mining camps and cattle ranches of the West. The financial losses were staggering. The total investment in the Pony Express, including stations, stock, and equipment, was estimated at $700,000. The revenue from mail carriage was less than $90,000. The company had spent over $4 million on its entire freight and mail empire, and it collapsed owing $2 million. The founders, once celebrated as the merchant princes of the plains, ended their days in obscurity. William Russell, after his disgrace, spent years trying to rebuild his reputation. He testified before Congress, wrote a memoir, and died in 1872, a broken man. Alexander Majors, the deeply religious master of ox trains, lived until 1900. He wrote a book called 70 Years on the Frontier, in which he barely mentioned the Pony Express, dismissing it as a short-lived and unprofitable venture. William Waddell faded from history so completely that even the date of his death is uncertain. The great scheme that had promised to bind the nation had burned through money like a prairie fire through dry grass, and when the fire was out, nothing was left but ash. The human cost is harder to quantify. The riders, station keepers, stock tenders, and cooks were scattered across the West. Some joined the Union Army. Others went south and fought for the Confederacy. A few, like the famous pony Bob Haslam, became legends in their own lifetimes, their exploits exaggerated by dime novels and newspaper reporters. Haslam himself went on to work for the Overland Mail Company, then as a deputy sheriff, then as a bodyguard for the wife of a Nevada senator. He lived until 1912, a relic of a vanished era, and when he died, the newspapers called him the last of the Pony Express riders, a title that had been given to so many men that it had lost all meaning. The real last rider was probably someone whose name was never recorded, a young man who finished his final run and then vanished into the anonymity of the frontier. The stations were abandoned. The corrals fell into disrepair. The adobe walls melted back into the desert. By 1870, most of the route was unrecognizable. The telegraph line followed the same path, and later the railroad and later the highway. The trace of the Pony Express was paved over, plowed under, or washed away by floods. Only a few isolated ruins remained, preserved by the dry air of the Great Basin or the remote location of the Wyoming grasslands. In time, the trail became a subject of antiquarian interest. Local historical societies erected markers. The Boy Scouts placed bronze plaques. The legend grew, layer upon layer, until the actual history was buried beneath it. The telegraph, by contrast, was an immediate and permanent success. Within a month of the completion, the line was carrying thousands of messages a day. The price of a telegram from coast to coast was set at $1 for 10 words, far cheaper than the Pony Express. Businesses adopted it instantly. Newspapers, which had relied on the Express for dispatches, switched to telegraphic news. The San Francisco Bulletin announced the death of the Pony Express with a single paragraph, noting that the equine messenger had been superseded by the lightning. The tone was one of progress, of relief, of a difficult burden finally lifted. No one mourned the horses. No one asked what would happen to the boys who had risked their lives. Why does it still matter? The Pony Express matters because it represents a transitional moment, a brief window of time when the speed of a horse was the fastest thing on the continent, and when the men who rode those horses became symbols of a particular kind of American courage. That courage was real, but it was also commodified. The company sold the image of the fearless rider to investors and the public, knowing that the reality was far more brutal. The riders were not mythic heroes. They were teenagers mostly, working for a paycheck, enduring cold, heat, thirst, and danger because the alternative was worse. Their story is a story of labor, not of mythology. It is the story of a system that used up human bodies and animal bodies until the wires could carry the words without any body at all. The 18 months of the Pony Express also coincided with the most convulsive period in American history. The service began just as the nation was tearing itself apart over slavery. The first rider carried news of the election crisis. The last rider carried news of the Civil War. In between, the Express carried speeches, editorials, business letters, love letters, and legal documents, all of them freighted with the anxieties of a people facing an uncertain future. The Pony Express was a thread that held the edges of the nation together during a moment when it seemed certain to split. That thread was thin, but it held. The telegraph, when it came, was a steel cable by comparison. But the thread had been there first, and it had been woven by hand. The legend persists because it is a story of speed, and speed is deeply embedded in the American identity. The Pony Express promised that a message could travel 2,000 miles in 10 days, a speed that had never been achieved before. It was a technological marvel as much as it was a human achievement, a system of precise timing, careful breeding, and relentless forward motion. The fact that it was also financially ruinous, logistically unsustainable, and violently destructive does not diminish the achievement. It complicates it. The Pony Express is a reminder that some of the most celebrated American institutions were built on debt, desperation, and disregard for human life. That does not make them less remarkable. It makes them more honest. The last ride of Henry Wallace ended at the Ruby Valley Station in what is now Nevada on the morning of October 28th. He handed the mochila to the station keeper, who set it aside. The mail would never go farther. Wallace unsaddled his horse, a bay mare named Dolly, and led her to the corral. He was exhausted. He had ridden 120 miles in 2 days. He ate a meal, slept for a night, and then rode the mare to a ranch near the Humboldt River where he sold her for $40. He kept the saddle. He would later use it on a cattle drive to Montana and then on a homestead in Oregon. He never spoke publicly about his time with the Pony Express. When he died in 1909, his obituary did not mention it. His children found the saddle in a barn, rotted and unusable, and threw it on a burn pile. The smoke rose into the Oregon sky and disappeared. The mochila that Wallace carried ended up in a collection of Western memorabilia. It is now displayed in a museum in St. Joseph, Missouri, under glass, with a small card that reads, "One of the last Pony Express mail pouches." Visitors look at it, read the card, and move on. The leather is cracked. The brass fittings are dull. The canvas lining is stained with sweat and ink. It is a mute object, but it speaks of a world that is gone. A world where a letter took 10 days, not 10 seconds. A world where the fate of a nation rested on the strength of a horse's legs and the courage of a young man with nothing to lose. That world is not coming back, but it left behind a trail, and the trail is still there, for those who know how to look. Look for it at dawn in the Great Basin, when the light is low and the sagebrush casts long shadows. Look for it in the old stagecoach stations, where the walls are worn thin by wind. Look for it in the archives, in the crumbling ledger books and the faded letters. Look for it in the memory of the land which holds every hoofprint, every fire, every body buried without a marker. The Pony Express lasted 18 months. The legend has lasted more than 160 years. The difference between the two is not just time. It is a gap that can never be closed, because a legend is what remains after the facts have been worn down to their essentials. The facts of the Pony Express are these: it was fast, it was expensive, it was violent, and it failed. The legend is something else. The legend is a horse running through the night, a rider bent low over the saddle, a mochila heavy with words, and a nation waiting for news. That image endures, and it always will, because it is not about what the Pony Express was. It is about what we need it to have been.